Welcome to this deep dive, where we really try to unpack the ideas shaping our world. Today, we're zeroing in on feminist sociology. Now, if you're a sociology student, look, understanding feminist perspectives isn't just, another chapter. It feels more like the bedrock for really getting how power, inequality, and society itself are put together.
Absolutely. And the term feminism, well, it can feel huge, right? Maybe even a bit overwhelming. So, our goal here in this deep dive is to kind of navigate that landscape. We want to pull out the core ideas, look at the diverse views within feminist sociology, and really offer a clear, engaging guide, especially for you sociology students who are tackling this essential area.
Okay, and what are we using as our guide here? We've got excerpts from Understanding Feminist Sociology, Perspectives and Concepts, and also the A-level Sociology bite-sized summary.
Yeah, think of those as our sort of curated resources. They give a pretty concise but comprehensive look at the key feminist thinking that's really impacted sociology.
Right, so the mission today is pretty clear. Give you a solid, engaging grasp of feminist sociology's main branches, its key concepts, and, importantly, how it all applies. All geared specifically for you sociology students navigating this, frankly, vital field. Okay, so let's jump in. What exactly is feminist sociology getting at?
Okay, so essentially, feminist sociology is about studying society from the perspective of women. It starts from recognizing that women have historically been in a subordinate position and, in many ways still are. So a primary aim is first understanding why and how, and then ultimately working towards ending that oppression.
Which that must really shake up the traditional way sociology tended to look at things. I remember reading about this idea of a male stream perspective. What was that about?
Exactly, that's a key point. For a long time, mainstream sociology, the research, the theories that operated from what feminists critically called a mainstream view. What that means is studies and theories often just ignored women's experiences completely. Or maybe they'd include them, but only as secondary, less important, or just in relation to men.
Oh,
So feminist sociology directly challenges that. It puts gender right at the center of the analysis. It highlights that gender isn't just biology. It's like a fundamental organizing principle of society and a huge source of inequality and conflict.
Can you give an example? Like, how did that male stream thing play out?
Sure. Think about early studies of the family. Often they focused almost entirely on the husband, the breadwinner role,
Yeah.
the experiences, the work, the contributions of wives and mothers, often completely overlooked or just assumed.
Gotcha. And a really key concept here for understanding this imbalance is patriarchy, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely central. Patriarchy. Feminist sociologists analyze how male dominance is built into the major institutions. We're talking family, education, media, politics, the workplace, all of them. They look at how these systems are often structured in ways that just inherently privilege men and disadvantage women.
Okay, so that paints a clearer picture of the core aims. But you mentioned diverse views earlier. It's not just one monolithic thing, is it?
Not at all. There are different schools of thought, different strands within feminism.
Right, so let's maybe dig into those main strands, starting with liberal feminism. What's their basic argument?
Okay, liberal feminism. Their core view is that inequality between men and women mostly comes from, outdated laws and attitudes, things that limit women's opportunities, especially in the public sphere work, politics, that kind of thing.
So their focus is on changing the system from within.
Pretty much. Their approach is largely about reform. Gradual change, step by step, using legal and policy reforms. Think about things like the Equal Pay Act or pushes for better educational access for girls. Those are classic liberal feminist goals.
So it's about leveling the playing field through laws and changing how people think.
Exactly. They put a lot of emphasis on gender role socialization, how we all learn to act masculine or feminine. They see that socialization process as a key source of inequality. Their belief is basically change the laws, change the attitudes, challenge those gender roles, and you'll get equality.
Any key thinkers associated with this?
Yeah, Anne Oakley is a big name, especially for her work on gender role socialization. And Jenny Somerville, too. She acknowledged progress, especially in families, but also pointed out that inequality definitely still persists.
Okay. But I can already sense some potential criticisms. Does it sound maybe a bit optimistic or maybe too focused on just the legal stuff?
That's definitely a common critique, yeah. Some argue it is overly optimistic and that it doesn't really dig deep enough into the more structural issues, the underlying patriarchy itself, or how capitalism might play a role. The criticism is sometimes that it's treating the symptoms, not the root causes.
Right, okay. So switching gears then, radical feminism. The name itself suggests something more, radical. What's their take?
It definitely is more fundamental. Radical feminists see patriarchy not just as one type of inequality, but as the primary, the most fundamental, the most universal form. They argue it exists across all societies throughout history, and their analysis really stresses that men directly benefit from women being subordinate.
How so? What kind of benefits are they talking about?
Well, think about unpaid domestic work, cooking, cleaning, childcare that women disproportionately do, or societal expectations around women providing sexual services in heterosexual relationships. And also the emotional labor, managing feelings, keeping relationships smooth, that often falls on women. Radical feminists argue these things give men power and privilege directly at women's expense.
And what about solutions from their perspective?
They often advocate for more transformative, even revolutionary changes. Things like separatism, women creating their own spaces, communities away from men. Also things like consciousness-raising groups, where women share experiences to understand oppression systemically. And even political lesbianism, choosing not to be in relationships with men as a political act against patriarchy. Germaine Greer, for instance, famously talked about women living in female-only households to escape male control.
Wow, okay. That's a very different approach. Are there common criticisms of radical feminism, too?
Oh, definitely. A major one is that it can be essentialist, meaning it sometimes assumes all women share one single core experience of oppression just because they're women. Critics argue this overlooks really crucial differences: race, class, sexuality, disability, you name it. It doesn't capture the huge diversity of women's lives. And actually, this critique helps spur the development of difference feminism, which we can get into. It shows how feminism evolves through its own internal debates.
Okay, interesting. Let's move on then. Marxist feminism, how does that fit in? Where's their focus?
Marxist feminism, as the name suggests, brings in that economic lens. They argue that, yes, patriarchy exists, it's real, but women's oppression is fundamentally rooted in capitalism. They'd say it primarily benefits the capitalist system, maybe even more than it benefits individual men. Their analysis highlights how women's roles in labor are crucial for capitalism to function smoothly.
Okay, like what? How do women prop up capitalism according to this view?
Well, several key ways. One is reproducing the labor force, literally having and raising children who become the next workers. Another point, quite starkly put by Fran Ansley, is that women often absorb the frustrations of male workers. They're the takers of shit, as she put it. Anger that might otherwise challenge the system gets directed home. And, of course, the huge amount of unpaid domestic labor women do, keeping homes running, feeding workers, raising kids, all that supports the paid workforce, freeing men up to work for wages.
So key thinkers here would be
Margaret Benston and Fran Ansley are definitely key figures associated with this strand. Their bottom line is, essentially, you can't end women's oppression without getting rid of capitalism itself.
So for them, it's less about just male dominance and more about the whole economic structure.
Exactly. But of course, there are critiques here, too. A common one is that Marxist feminism can sometimes underplay patriarchy as its own distinct system of power. The power dynamics between men and women that exist regardless of the economic system. Critics say it can be too focused on economics, maybe missing other parts of the picture.
All right. Okay, so that brings us to the last major strand you mentioned, difference or postmodern feminism. This sounds like it really challenges the idea of a single feminist viewpoint.
It absolutely does. Difference and postmodern feminists critique that tendency in some other feminist strands to assume there's this universal woman's experience. They argue, look, women's lives are incredibly diverse. They're shaped by a whole mix of intersecting factors, not just gender, but class, race, ethnicity, sexuality, age, ability, location. The list goes on.
So black feminism would fit in here.
Precisely. Black feminism was a really powerful example of this critique in action. It showed how the experiences often centered in earlier feminist theory, usually those of white middle-class women, just didn't reflect the realities for women of color who face sexism and racism. Thinkers like bell hooks really drove this point home, emphasizing that intersectionality.
It's about recognizing that complexity, the overlapping identities and oppressions.
Exactly. And you also have thinkers like Judith Butler, who famously theorized gender not as some fixed biological thing, but as a performance, something we do. They all fall under this broad umbrella, emphasizing there isn't one female experience. And trying to create a single unified theory can actually end up marginalizing lots of women.
But does focusing so much on difference and maybe the fluidity of identity create its own problems for, like, political action?
That's the key criticism, yeah. This fragmentation, this heavy emphasis on diversity, and the critique of broad categories like woman, well, Some argue it can make it harder to build collective action. If there's no single woman to organize around, how do you mobilize for large-scale change? It's a real tension.
Okay, so we've sketched out these four main strands: liberal, radical, Marxist, and difference postmodern. Now let's maybe zoom in on some core concepts that cut across these or are central to feminist theory generally. We've mentioned patriarchy a lot. What else should sociology students really get to grips with?
Okay, well, gender socialization is absolutely fundamental. We touched on it with liberal feminism, but it's broader than that. It's basically the lifelong process where we learn the behaviors, the attitudes, the expectations considered right for our assigned gender in our society. It happens everywhere: family, media, school, friends. We're constantly learning how to do gender from day one.
We're sort of internalizing society's script for being male or female.
Kind of, yeah. Then there's intersectionality, super important concept, really developed by Kimberly Crenshaw. It highlights how different forms of oppression like racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, they don't just operate separately. They intersect, they interact, they overlap. This creates unique, often compounded experiences of disadvantage or privilege.
Can you give a quick example?
Sure, think about a working-class Black woman. Her experience of, say, job discrimination might be shaped by both racism and sexism, and maybe class bias, too, in ways that are different from a white middle-class woman facing primarily sexism, or a Black middle-class man facing primarily racism. Or imagine maybe a disabled woman trying to access health care. Her challenges might involve sexism and ableism interacting. It's about how these systems combine.
That really clarifies how inequalities aren't just additive, they kind of multiply each other.
Right.
What about the public-private divide?
Right. Feminists have long pointed out this tendency in society to draw a sharp line between the public world, work, politics, business, historically seen as male domains, and the private world of home, family, personal life, often seen as the female sphere. The crucial feminist point is that oppression and inequality aren't just out there in the public sphere. They happen significantly within the private realm, too. If you only look at public life, you miss huge power dynamics and inequalities within families, within households.
Like what kind of things?
Well, the classic example is the unequal division of housework and childcare, right? Who does the second shift? Or, more darkly, the issue of domestic violence. That happens in the private sphere, but it's a major focus for feminist sociology, showing how power operates even in intimate relationships.
Okay, so with these concepts and perspectives in mind, how does this actually change sociological research? Where do feminist sociologists apply these ideas?
Oh, everywhere, really. Feminist perspectives have reshaped how we study loads of social institutions. Take the family. Feminists look at who does the paid work, who does the unpaid work, the dynamics of power, domestic violence, emotional labor, the work of managing feelings and relationships. In education, they analyze why boys and girls might choose different subjects, why there are still attainment gaps in some areas, how teachers' expectations might subtly influence students based on gender.
And the media.
Huge area. Analyzing stereotypes, sexualization of women, how media messages shape our ideas about gender roles and identities, even in crime and deviance studies. Feminist perspectives look at how gender influences who commits crime, who becomes a victim, and maybe how the justice system treats men and women differently.
It really sounds like feminism has just permeated like the whole discipline of sociology. But like any big theory, it gets criticized, right?
Yeah.
We've mentioned some internal critiques between strands, but what about broader criticisms aimed at feminism overall?
Yeah, there are definitely broader critiques. As we touched on, some strands, maybe especially radical feminism, get accused of determinism, like women are always oppressed in the same way, or essentialism, assuming all women share some unchanging essence. Liberal feminism, as we said, gets called too reformist, not radical enough. Marxist feminism can be seen as too focused on economics, maybe downplaying patriarchy itself. And then you have postmodern arguments suggesting maybe the categories man and woman are dissolving, becoming so fluid and individual that older feminist analyses based on those groups don't fit anymore.
Okay, but despite all that, it's clearly been massively influential. What would you say are the main strengths, the biggest contributions of feminism to sociology?
Oh, absolutely massive contributions. First and foremost, it dragged the issue of gender inequality out of the margins and put it center stage across all areas of social life. Issues often totally ignored before. It's also been a driving force behind real-world policy changes. Think equal pay laws, laws against sex discrimination, domestic violence legislation. That's huge practical impact. Plus, it led to whole new fields like gender studies and gave us indispensable concepts like intersectionality. And really importantly, I think, it pushed sociology itself to be more reflexive, to make researchers question their own biases, especially the potential for a male default perspective to shape their work.
So bringing it back to the sociology students listening, why is grappling with all this, the different strands, the concepts, the applications, the criticisms, why is it so relevant for them right now?
Look, it's absolutely essential. Gender is just the fundamental way society is organized, and it's a critical axis of inequality. You simply can't understand social issues, power, social change properly without engaging critically with feminist ideas. And you'll see as you study how these theories connect with, and sometimes really clash with, other big perspectives, functionalism, Marxism, postmodernism. Being able to compare and contrast them, like our source material suggests for exams, that shows real sociological understanding. Ultimately, getting a solid handle on feminist sociology gives you vital tools to analyze the complex social world, to see how gender inequality persists, and to evaluate the ongoing efforts to tackle it.
Right. So just to wrap things up then, we've seen that feminism and sociology isn't one single thing. It's a really diverse, evolving set of perspectives, but they all offer these crucial lenses for understanding inequality, for understanding social structures. We've looked at the main strands, liberal, radical, Marxist, difference, postmodern, each with its own diagnosis and proposed solutions. We've touched on those core concepts like patriarchy, gender socialization, intersectionality, stuff that's just vital for any sociological toolkit.
Exactly. And the key thing, I think, for you as students is to engage with these ideas critically,
Hmm.
understand their strengths, yeah, but also see their limitations, recognize how they continue to shape debates about gender, power, and equality today. It's an ongoing conversation.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you to chew on, maybe take away from this deep dive. Considering all these different strands we've discussed, liberal, radical, Marxist, difference, postmodern, which one, or maybe which combination, resonates most with your understanding of gender inequality today? And crucially, why might other sociologists, perhaps drawing on different theories or even different feminist ideas, disagree with your take? It's a big question, no easy answer, but it really gets you thinking about the ongoing relevance and the dynamic nature of feminist thought in sociology. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.